Welcome to Novara Live on this Friday evening. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Yeah, it's good to be here standing in for Aaron on his usual Friday slot. Hopefully I'll be able to live up to his expertise.
Yeah, I got a call yesterday afternoon from Aaron saying, sorry, I'm not going to be able to do Friday night. You'll be pleased to know, though, it's because he is working. He was making a video, I think, in Bournemouth, Bastani's Britain. I'm not sure if we've officially called his series of videos where he goes around the country that yet, but we definitely should be. So you can look forward to some Aaron Bastani soon, hopefully, walking around Bournemouth, I would imagine, where he's from, in fact. Coming up tonight, Nigel Farage has unveiled plans to turn the UK into a cryptocurrency hub. I'll be asking an expert why right-wingers seem so keen on crypto. So we've got Farage, he's joining Trump, Bukele, Malay, in all having an obsession with crypto, all speaking at crypto conferences and the like. We're going to do a follow-up to the story that was covered yesterday on Robert Jenrick's Vigilante Twitter video. I think only because it has sparked quite an interesting national debate. So we're going to look at some of the fallout from that. And finally, the CEO of Anthropic. We've been hearing quite a lot from him recently, but he has a lot of interesting things to say. Not that I particularly trust him. He's warned that AI could decimate white-collar jobs. I think this could turn out to be, one of the biggest stories of this decade, if not the biggest. Stay tuned for all of that. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Israel have jointly agreed to ceasefire proposals which they are putting to Hamas. Now, Hamas currently say they're looking at those proposals closely, though it is, we should say, very, very unlikely that they will accept. Dropsite News got their hands on the draft proposals, and in an interview with Electronic Intifada, Jeremy Scahill explained why.
There is language in this so-called term sheet that clearly was crafted to appease Netanyahu and Israel. Hamas had been led to believe that there was going to be a much firmer commitment by President Trump to ensure that there was an understandable, clear pathway to a permanent end to the genocide and a full withdrawal of Israeli forces. In this term sheet, it's language that the Israelis have been pushing throughout the ceasefire process over the past 19 months, and it doesn't lock in anything. It basically just has language in it that says that the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, are going to make good faith efforts to ensure that negotiations are serious toward a permanent end to the war. But there's no mechanism for enforcement. And Israel, of course, has a PhD in violating ceasefires. They're continuing to terror bomb Gaza every single day, despite the fact that there was a U.S. guaranteed ceasefire that took effect in January.
So I thought that was a really useful intervention from Jeremy Scahill, and I suppose basically explaining why this is pretty much a charade, right? Israel is saying, let's have another ceasefire. What we're going to do is we're going to have a very brief pause. We're not even going to guarantee that we'll remove our occupation forces. We're not going to say how much aid will enter Gaza. Oh, and by the way, once we've got our hostages back, we will feel free to start the war again. So they're offering Hamas a very short pause in a war of extermination in exchange for hostages. We've been here before, haven't we? There have been two ceasefires before on both occasions. Israel got some hostages back and then started the genocidal war again. Hamas have been quite clear throughout that what they want is some mechanism to have a permanent ceasefire. And from what Jeremy Scahill was saying there, the proposals that have been put forward this time are even weaker than in some previous agreements. And while this charade of ceasefire talks continues, Israel is continuing its slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And this is from Dropsite again. So this is a tweet they posted today. So it says, new Israeli forces attack Gaza aid seekers and injure 20. And then it says, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so that's this sham aid organization, opened a third aid center in Beruj, central Gaza this morning. Palestinians walked miles to reach it, only to be met with live fire, tank shells, and grenades dropped by quadcopters. A drone later broadcast a message in Arabic ordering them to evacuate, saying aid would not be distributed today. Tens of injuries were reported, with patients transferred to Al-Auda Hospital in Nusrat and Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah. Among them, a father of 2 hit by shrapnel in the neck from a tank shell. He survived, thankfully. Drop site also shared footage of that drone hovering above the food distribution point. You can just see how dystopian that looks. If you're listening on the podcast, that was a drone sort of blaring out in Arabic, "There will be no distribution today, and there will be a new distribution point announced." And you have to understand this is people who've traveled for miles in a war zone, subject to shelling, bombing, terrified for their lives. And then you get to what's supposed to be a distribution site, even though it's completely sham and done via this fake humanitarian organization. And then you're told by a drone that, "Oh, actually, no, it's closed today, sorry." Obviously, you can't ask any questions. You can't ask why. You can't challenge why you were told there'd be aid here and there isn't anymore, because you're only being communicated to via a drone, via a robot in the sky. Obviously, drones as well are going to be something which instills people with terror, given that they are also a means by which people get assassinated. And the UN humanitarian chief, Tom Fletcher, has given an interview to the BBC, the UN getting sort of ever louder in their protestations at Israel's sort of starvation of the people of Gaza. And he, in this interview, all but accused Israel of ethnic cleansing.
So out loud, Israeli ministers have been saying that they want the population of Gaza to be relocated.
Is that ethnic cleansing?
It's the forced removal of a population.
Ethnic cleansing.
And in this case, by withholding of aid. Now, again, the courts will judge what to call that, and I have to pick my words very, very carefully. I'm a humanitarian, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician.
To be clear, what we are seeing is the forced starvation of the population.
We're seeing food sat on the borders and not being allowed in when there is a population on the other side of the border that is starving. And we're hearing Israeli ministers say that is to put pressure on the population of Gaza. Now, we just want to work. We have a plan to deliver, we just want to get in.
That's a war crime, isn't it? If you use food as a weapon.
Yeah. It is classified as a war crime. Obviously, these are issues for the courts to take the judgment on, and ultimately for history to take a judgment on.
So, Tom Fletcher there, I mean, we've showed you clips of him speaking to the UN, as I say, sort of getting ever more desperate in his, it's not a warning to the world anymore because it's already happening, but in his sort of desperate calls to the world to do something about this genocide. He is, though, to some degree, pulling his punches. You saw that he kept saying, I'm a humanitarian, I don't want to make legal judgments. And one of his predecessors in his UN role, though, was more forthright this week. So this was Martin Griffiths. He's former UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, speaking to Sky.
So you do believe what we are now seeing as a result of inaction and not allowing aid to get into the territory and for this bombardment and killing to continue, you do believe it's genocide?
I do. You know, I'm a lawyer, actually, although probably not something many people know, nor even me. So I've been, messing around with the issue of declarations and adjustments and assessments. But I think now we've got to the point this is unequivocal. Of course it is genocide, just as it is weaponizing aid. We don't need to look behind ourselves to see that that's the case. And that should encourage us even more, because, of course, we all doubted whether it come to that level of definition. We all doubted whether famine was actually there. I think starvation is killing people. That's bad enough. We don't have to worry about famine, which is obviously there lurking in the shadows. But also genocide. Of course, that's what's happened. And we only need to look at the statements by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has the virtue of being very clear about his objectives.
Western governments, like our own, are of course deeply implicated in this genocide. We're still sending arms to a country which is committing genocide, as you just heard there from a former top UN official. Also implicated are Britain's pension funds. Now, that's according to a new report by my colleague Harriet Williamson. Nest, which manages the pensions of over 13 million people in Britain, has investments in Israeli arms company Elbit Systems. And I caught up with Harriet earlier today.
During this story, we really looked into the publicly available data that Nest has on where it invests its pensions. And we found that from December 2024, it had a small exposure in the Israeli weapons company Elbit Systems. And the way that large pension funds like Nest work is they often parcel up their money and they give it to asset managers or different asset management companies. And those companies then will pick a standard FTSE index fund and they just chuck a whole bunch of money in there. So Nest confirmed to us that even though they could say for sure that we'd been investing pensions in Elbit since December 2024, customers' money on the default fund and the higher risk fund could well have had exposure to Elbit previously, depending on when Elbit had slipped out of or into a specific FTSE index.
So did they make a decision specifically in December 2024 to invest in Elbit Systems? Or, as you say, is this something that sort of happens passively because they're in a number of, these index funds, and one of these index funds is in Elbit? I suppose what I'm asking is, did something change in December, or is this just that something was revealed in December?
I think that something was definitely revealed in December in terms of it started to show up in their publicly available documents, which is how we got hold of this story, essentially. It was a concerned member of the public who actually sent us a tip because they were so disgusted to find through Nest's documents available online that their pension was being invested in Elbit Systems. I think that with pension funds, there is sort of a degree of remove in terms of the fact that they don't want to take a massive amount of responsibility in terms of where the money is going. They claim on their website to be a responsible investment, to have a responsible investment policy. But when you actually dig into this, and please do read the article on the website because it contains the response from Nest, where they say that they do have a policy about weapons. But if you actually look at that, it's only specific types of weapons. And that creates a whole question about whether it's better or worse to be killed by a large bomb of some other description or a cluster bomb. So Nest won't invest in companies that make cluster bombs, for example, or biological or chemical weapons, but they will invest in Elbit Systems and the weapons that it makes, which have been implicated in the killing of uncounted. We know that at least 60,000 Palestinians have been killed in the conflict in Gaza, in Israel's genocide on the besieged enclave, but we obviously don't know exactly how many of them have been killed by Elbit-made weapons.
And Elbit Systems are now a very high-profile, controversial company, largely because of the actions by the activist group Palestine Action at their sites in the UK. Are there other pension funds or organisations that have divested from Elbit Systems thanks to pressure?
We know definitely that the East Sussex Local Pension Fund has been forced to divest, and we know that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign is also putting quite a lot of pressure on other local government pension funds that have got links to companies that are implicated in Israel's genocidal war. They're companies like BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, Caterpillar. But the interesting thing about Nest is that Elbit is an Israeli company. So it seems even more egregious that British workers should be saving their pension funds money for their retirement into an overseas company that has been implicated in mass death and killing, including the specific killing of 3 British aid workers.
And as far as I understand, Nest is kind of the default pension fund that most employers go to. If someone watching thinks that their pension is invested in Nest and they're unhappy about it going to, or a small part of it going to Elbit Systems, do you have any sort of advice about what they could do?
Yeah, so Nest is an auto-enroll pension. So you kind of go into it automatically if you fit the pretty broad eligibility criteria. And it was set up by the government to ensure that everybody could be in a low-cost pension scheme automatically. And this makes it quite difficult for people to know where their money is going. Like, you're probably not going to trawl through the thousands of companies that Nest currently invests in off your own back unless you have a lot of time. And even then, you may not think to. Nest's default fund and its high risk fund both invest in Elbit, but there is the option to move into a more specifically ethical fund. They have the Nest Ethical Fund or the Nest Sharia Fund. But Nest themselves say that at least 99% of their customers never move out of the default one. My personal instinct would be to move out of Nest altogether and not stay with a pension fund that puts any of its money anywhere near Elbit systems.
That was my colleague Harriet Williamson speaking to me earlier today. There's a link to that article in the description. Helena, I suppose I want to go to you actually on the story that we started the show with, which is sort of this talk of a ceasefire. And I suppose my assumption is that the reason the Israelis and the Americans keep putting forward these ceasefire proposals, which Hamas couldn't possibly agree to, is because then they hope they will get a headline which says Hamas rejects ceasefire, so that the attention will be put on them and they can say, well, it's the Palestinians who don't want peace.
I mean, that's basically been the case for a very long time in terms of the way that this ceasefire talks have been presented to Western audiences, right? They have this idea that, well, Hamas are the ones who are totally unreasonable, who will refuse to engage in any kind of plan to be able to bring the war to an end. When, of course, that's a complete inversion of reality up till now, because actually it's been the Israelis who have been the ones who have broken ceasefires or have ignored ceasefires, who have delayed any actual diplomatic means with which to release the hostages that they say are the fulcrum on which this war lies. Of course, it's not. This is obviously a lie as well. It is not the hostages on which the war is fought on. It's upon the elimination and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from Gaza. That's the thing, right? The hostages are a convenient excuse, which is why it is necessary for the Western press, especially, to be able to launder that narrative through the idea that the Hamas are the ones who are being unreasonable in terms of ceasefire negotiations up till now. Like, if they've actually reported on the reality of those negotiations, we know that it was Israel that's the problem. So they actually need some firm evidence to be able to say that Hamas are the ones who are refusing a ceasefire, so they can find some kind of completely irreconcilable schism in terms of the proposal, so that Hamas are basically under duress to not accept it, and then they can pin on Hamas as being the ones who are refusing to ratify some kind of deal. The other issue as well, is that what Hamas apparently have been saying is that they have some skepticism over US brokered ceasefire deals, because, of course, we were having this discussion when the very first ceasefire happened under the Trump administration earlier on this year. What we were discussing was, is it something which we think might be long lasting? Will they get to phase 2? Or is this some kind of compromise deal as far as Israel is concerned, as far as Netanyahu is concerned? Oh, well, we'll look like we're trying to do some peace. We'll get some hostages returned, and then we'll restart the genocide. And obviously you were taking the latter part, and I was hopefully taking the former. And unfortunately, you were correct. It was just an attempt where they were going to get some hostages free and then continue the assault by claiming the Hamas were being unreasonable, when, of course, it was Israel that broke the terms there. Israel were the ones who refused to move to stage 2 and wanted to get more out of the deal after it had already gone ahead, without even informing the people who are the other side of this negotiation. And then, of course, what did the Western press do? They laundered the narrative that it was Hamas's fault, when it was explicitly Israel that changed the deal after it had been ratified and before moving to stage 2 to get more concessions, so that Hamas couldn't agree to it, so they could therefore restart the genocide all over again. And whilst I at least think that Witkoff probably is a little bit more amenable to some kind of peace negotiation, given that they've been speaking to Hamas behind the back of Netanyahu already, I don't think the Trump administration outside of Witkoff necessarily wants the same thing and would happily acquiesce to the same kind of deal that we had before, which would allow Netanyahu to not end the conflict. Because, of course, there is no incentive. There is literally zero incentive for Netanyahu to not continue the conflict and to actually approach some kind of ceasefire, because as soon as the war ends, so does his political career. As soon as the war ends, so does his dreams of the conquest of Gaza, over expanding Israel into what they would describe as Judea and Samaria, right, to expand greater Israel. That project is something that he cares about, and his own personal ambitions to maintain his leadership of the country forever is also his ambition, and he doesn't care about hostages. He hasn't done since the start of the conflict, and he doesn't care about the lives of Palestinians, obviously. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen what's been happening over the last 20 months. So I don't think there is any kind of movement that we'll see But I do hope maybe something will happen. But this is a very, very faint possibility. One last thing I would say was that there was the academic there talk about how it's a clear case of genocide, right? And we seem to be seeing the context of the discussion change in the mainstream, where it was just the left who was clearly calling out the genocide that it was. We even saw Gary Lineker thrown upon the hot coals for retweeting Owen Jones interviewing an Israeli genocide scholar, claiming that it was a genocide at the time, right? It was essentially being called blood libel by people on social media for the Gary Lineker who's just sharing this particular piece of media that was rightly calling out what we all now have seen to be the case. And what we've seen is that when governments have changed their positions, I was watching Heidi Alexander on Question Time earlier today saying, well, we're trying everything we can. Well, they're not. They're not trying everything they can. We now have seen a universal acknowledging of the genocide by academics across countries and disciplines and universities, wherever they're from, and yet the government still isn't doing anything, all the things that it could be doing and pulling all of those levers. Whilst it still flies flights from RAF Akrotiri, we still have Mir Eagle, we're celebrating those flights, we're still seeing a lack of sanctions upon Israel rather than just on individual settlers, and we're still seeing companies with links to settlements in the West Bank doing business in the United Kingdom, drilling for our oil, for example, on our territorial waters in the North Sea, right? These things have to be stopped if we want to actually put pressure on, because again, it's only material pressure that Israel will respond to, because Netanyahu's ideological goals will trump any amount of words or rhetoric that does not come with action.
You know, I suppose on this pension story, because I think lots of people will sort of feel very disgusted if they feel that sort of the money they're saving for their retirement is implicated in this kind of thing. I assume sort of the first thing one can do is sort of write to one's employer and say, can we shift our pension scheme to the ethical fund instead of the non-ethical fund? It's funny, isn't it, that you have non-ethical funds? Maybe there's a sort of, presumably there's a slightly smaller return on the ethical one, because obviously selling weapons to Israel is very big business. I think Elbit Systems, while it has become very controversial because they are literally sort of, I suppose, arming the genocidal state, they're an Israeli arms company. They're more implicated than almost anyone here. I think their profits are massively up. But yeah, presumably this could be one of those things where people write to their employers, say, I'm concerned that we are signed up to this pension fund. Can we switch? It might also be the case that you can do it as an individual. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on pensions. I don't know if are you an expert on pensions? Can you tell me any more about this? Sorry to put you on the spot, because I know I didn't tell you to be an expert on pensions before you came on the show tonight.
Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on pensions, but what I will say, there's a broader context here, which is that since the kind of neoliberal turn in the 1980s, we have been treated to view transactions under capitalism as being completely outside of any kind of moral considerations, right? And this kind of praxeological, this kind of neolibertarian ideology of how we should approach kind of free market politics and the way we interact with markets, right? The moral concerns are not relevant. And in fact, plenty of people on the left have kind of half embraced this language of saying, well, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, right? Which is a statement that is true, and it's not, that's not a tacit endorsement of unethical consumption. You should be engaging as much ethical consumption as possible, but some people treat it to mean that when that's obviously untrue. But it's going to take a real kind of cultural shift, I think, broadly. And if people can have the position where they can change their pension funds to be more ethical, and in fact, if they can ask, for example, the businesses that are allowed to get government contracts or be given licenses to be able to operate in this country, or for all I was pointing out before, they should be having some kind of ethical consideration with where that money goes, who we do business with, and how we comport ourselves within those markets, right? That's been something that's been kind of missing from politics and from consumption since we have come to this really kind of dispassionate form of free market capitalism in the wake of Thatcherism becoming cultural. It's kind of a cultural neoliberal world that we live in. And so if we want to see a big uptake in people changing their pension funds to try and look towards moving away from investments in anything unethical, whether it's Israel or not, we need to spread that kind of discussion of ethical consumption, I think.
Nigel Farage is the latest right-wing leader to get the crypto bug. He said this to a crypto conference in Las Vegas, of all places, on Thursday night.
I'm thrilled to be here today, but to announce that rather than just words, we have put together, and this is exclusive for today, the Crypto Assets and Digital Finance Bill.
Months of work, ladies and gentlemen.
We will campaign for this, and we'll put it in place when we win the next general election. And what we're saying is bring crypto and digital assets in from the cold. Have a capital gains rate of 10%. And that means, if taxes are reasonable, people will pay them. We're going to have a Bitcoin digital reserve in the Bank of England. And we are going to pass legislation that says that no bank can close your account because you're trading in legal crypto or digital products.
So Farage's plan for a Bitcoin digital reserve, in the central bank, in the Bank of England, I suppose, is following in the footsteps of his friend Donald Trump, who in March signed an executive order creating a federal Bitcoin reserve. Trump infamously also created his own Trump coin, as did his wife Melania. And Trump Media, which includes Truth Social, has just this week raised $2.5 billion to invest in Bitcoin. Of course, when it comes to Trump, lots of this can be put down to the president using whatever means possible to use his time in the White House to increase his personal wealth. But there is also an ideological angle here, and crypto is a specific obsession of multiple leaders on the populist right. So in February, Argentina's President Milei was engulfed in a crypto scandal after promoting a digital currency that lost investors millions. And this month, he shut down the task force created to investigate that scandal. Meanwhile, in El Salvador, Nayib Bukele is also a big believer in crypto. In 2021, El Salvador became the first country to make Bitcoin legal tender, and they invested millions in Bitcoin reserves. However, the country's recent application for an IMF loan has meant the young right-wing leader has had to scale back on his Bitcoin dream. So what is the connection between right-wing politics and crypto? And how worried should we all be? Well, Rachel O'Dwyer is the author of Tokens, The Future of Money in the Age of the Platform, and she joins me now. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. What is the relationship between right-wing politics and cryptocurrencies? I suppose I used to remember this as being a kind of left libertarian thing. People in the squatting movement are often sort of quite enthusiastic about crypto. Now it seems to be very much right-coded. Why? What do all these right-wingers have in common that means they're all sort of gravitating towards crypto?
Well, it's funny because my first introduction to crypto, right, was in maybe 2011, 2012, 2013, and as you say, to me, it was quite left-coded, because you understood it as being something that could potentially allow you to redesign money at a moment when a lot of people's trust in the financial system was breaking down. But actually, the history of Bitcoin, if you go back to the kind of early mailing lists from the 90s, where a lot of these technologies were hashed out, is very, it's kind of a free market libertarian or anarcho-capitalist. So, it's about rejecting the state in favor, I suppose, of the perfect exercise of free markets. I think today, though, we're seeing this huge kind of love affair between right-wingers and crypto, because it's less about the technology maybe and what that can do and more about almost ideology and image. So I think for figures like Trump and Farage and Milei and Bukele, that crypto it's kind of being rebranded as sort of anti-establishment politics. So something that was anarchist is kind of being almost brought into the state now and used to signal, freedom from regulation, from taxation, from the central bank. And it lets them, I think it's also interesting, maybe it lets these sorts of right-wing leaders perform power without appearing authoritarian, even as they consolidate control. So it's not really about decentralization in the way maybe we would have associated with kind of left-wing projects. It's about using crypto to signal sovereignty and rebellion and to attract attention. So kind of vibes as opposed to like viable economic policy.
And I suppose, could you, it's a question that takes us a few steps back, but I suppose in a way sort of explain why crypto matters. Because, there are lots of technologies which get a lot of buzz. I'm very much sort of taken in by the buzz around AI. We're going to talk about it later today as well. Not because I think it's going to necessarily bring us a brilliant future, but I think it clearly is going to, well, I think sort of revolutionize society for better or worse. Bitcoin to me has always seemed like a sort of obsession of a small number of people who are getting quite rich from it, basically because other people are piling in their money. It looks like a bit of a Ponzi scheme, but it doesn't seem to be popping. Is there, should I care more about crypto than I currently do? Should I be paying more attention to this movement than I have been up to now?
No, I guess I don't. I mean, maybe we should be paying attention to it because even things that are silly and ideological, like Trump, Trump was the meme president, can have a real, can have an impact. But I think at the moment, in theory, crypto can serve various purposes, but in practice, I think it's mostly symbolic. So it's sort of part of this sort of new, I guess, speculative kind of state in that sense. I mean, there have been progressive experiments with crypto, local currencies, time banks, various different kind of experiments with using like the underlying technologies like smart contracts to give citizens better control of their data. There was an interesting sort of pilot project in Barcelona a few years ago that was sort of trying to see, what are the applications of these that might be actually useful. But it seems like, for those sort of current right-wing people, it's mostly, I think, about symbolism and attention as opposed to actually materially transforming anything. So there is a left-aligned crypto history. There's, these different cooperative models, but it rarely scales or gets state support. But the state loves crypto when it helps sort of market itself as modern or rebellious.
And I suppose the Trump situation, which I know more about than Milei or Bukele, and I suppose with Nigel Farage, we're still quite early in this story. But the Trump situation seems to be largely that he's using crypto as a slush fund. So he sort of has this Trump coin. And if you want to donate money to Trump, but in a way which is very difficult to trace, you could just buy a bunch of Trump coins, which pushes up its price. That will increase the value in Donald Trump's pockets, because I suppose he created these Trump coins out of thin air. And so lots of people are just saying this is a way that you can pay Donald Trump bungs without anyone noticing. Also, I suppose there is a big conflict of interest because Donald Trump is buying into Bitcoin whilst making decisions which will inflate the price of Bitcoin, because obviously the Federal Reserve is creating a Bitcoin reserve. That's going to increase the demand for Bitcoin. Increasing the demand for Bitcoin raises the price. So you can see this as sort of Donald Trump just trying to get personally rich. And Donald Trump is ideological about some things, tariffs, borders, but the thing that seems to drive him more than anything is his own ego and his own personal enrichment. So you can almost see, this is as beyond politics. It's just a venal politician who wants to get rich. Is there a similar situation sort of in El Salvador, Argentina, Farage? Can we sort of, I suppose, extrapolate from the Trump situation onto all these other right-wing leaders who've sort of fully bought into the crypto hype?
I mean, I think the Trump situation it's so singular in that sense, and that it's this like crazy economic moment where by making these, not just making pro-crypto policies, but, actually issuing his own coin, that the president actually stands to economically benefit, as you said, from the sort of policies that are being put in place. So there is, I suppose, that sort of monetary aspect definitely with Trump. But I think, it's not just a financial scam. It's also like a political branding strategy. Crypto can sort of signal, I suppose, to investors, to voters, to tech bros that, we're the party of freedom, of risk, of sovereignty in some weird way, even though it's, it's sort of sovereignty coming from the state, anarchism coming from within the state. So I think for a lot of these politicians, it's not just about lining their pockets, it's about dominating the news cycle, looking like a founder, almost turning national identity into a brand. Like we're almost seeing these states sort of operate more, in the line with Silicon Valley venture capital than with what we might have understood as like the state.
And I suppose, there's lots of things to worry about at the moment. So sometimes we should ration, our concern. And I suppose in a way what I'm hearing from you is that, Farage, Trump, Bukele, Milei, these right-wingers all piling into Bitcoin isn't necessarily this sort of incredibly thought-out conspiracy that's going to screw us all. It's potentially a sideshow. Some of them want to get rich. Some of them are doing it as a branding exercise. Should we be fearful of these right-wingers piling into Bitcoin? Is there any sort of mechanism by which this deeply affects all of us, or can we treat this as a concerning sideshow?
I mean, I think it's concerning because that sort of ideology obviously plays out in, maybe it doesn't necessarily play out in the kind of pro-crypto policy necessarily, but, it sort of has echoes then in terms of also how the state sees itself as doing governance. So, something like, if we go back to the States, Trump and, Musk and Dogecoin are sort of the other side of that. So I think, I was talking there about the idea of the state sort of recasting sovereignty in speculative terms, so acting like a hedge fund almost. But there's also a sense that there's this sort of imaginary of what governance looks like that goes along with that, which is very much about removing all the messiness of human politics and kind of the lag of bureaucracy in favor of some kind of vision of, algorithmic, like perfect sort of control. So like a kind of democracy without people nearly. And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but I feel like there are these sorts of, concerning and material effects that go alongside what we can dismiss as being like vibes and memes. It feels like a lot of politics now is a vibe, and the vibe has a sort of a material underbelly.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely something gross about it. Sort of, where I was looking at JD Vance giving that speech to the crypto conference in Vegas. Obviously, because the association with crypto that I thought they would want to sort of remove themselves from is that it's all just gambling, and then for some reason they have all their conferences in Las Vegas. Anyway, Rachel O'Dwyer, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Really, really interesting stuff. Robert Jenrick's vigilante Twitter video. We showed it yesterday. It's clocked up 12 million views on X. I mean, it sparked a really big national debate, actually. And so, as I said, we showed you the video in full yesterday. Just to jog your memory before we look at some of the reactions, here's a short part of it.
Excuse me, do you think it's all right not to pay? Seriously, why do you go back through the barrier and pay? Do you want to go back and pay like everybody else? Do you think it's all right not to pay? Why don't you go back and pay? You can say off as much as you want, but everyone else has to pay. You're carrying a knife, do you say? Nearly 1 in 25 people using London's public transport aren't paying for it. So there's 8 officers down there, but 1 minute away, that gate's wide open. It's also just annoying watching so many people break the law and get away with it.
So that video has divided opinion. There are lots of people saying it's accidental partridge, other people saying it's very effective political communication. And what's undeniable is it has had an impact. Not many people are paying attention to any Tory politicians at the moment. So to get 12 million views on your Twitter video, that's an achievement in itself to some degree. As for the responses, I think you can divide them into basically three main groups. So the first is people who agree with Jenrick and say that crime is a growing problem and that it's caused by police or other law enforcement officials going too soft. A second argument, obviously much more common on the left, is to say that yes, there has been an increase in rule breaking, or at least an increase in general social decay, but the cause isn't soft policing, but rather poverty or cuts to social services under years of austerity. There's also the third position. This one's often put forward, or is being put forward by some liberals, that it's the problem in the first place, which is actually massively overstated. This was Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio.
Do you really think that? I mean, I've been in this city 25 years now. I wander around. I love it. It's a sort of vibrant, joyful place. I mean, do you really think it's a more scary place to be than it was 20 years ago?
Yeah, I do. Look, I mean, like you,
crime is down.
Like you, I think London is an
amazing
city, and I want it to be the best city in the world. But if you talk to people, they are now worried about going out in London. People are not wearing watches. People are worried about their mobile phones being stolen. Nightlife is massively down in London because young people don't feel that it's the safe city that they want to live in. So, this is what people say to me. This is, I think, the vibe that you get in London. And it is Sadiq Khan who has been presiding over this, and he needs to step up and take action.
The idea that the problem with nightlife is that people are worried about crime, I think, is very, very unconvincing. A much better explanation here, I think, is that lots of, bars have closed down because rents are very high. And also, I think the real one here, and so many stories, I think the real explanation of this changing trend is smartphones and social media. People hang out less than they used to because they spend more time on their phones. I think that's a big shame. I don't think that's because of sort of widespread social disorder. We'll show you some data in a moment. First of all, Helena, I want to get sort of your thoughts on this. I sort of laid out 3, I suppose, responses that people have had to this Robert Jenrick video. It's been sort of all over the news for the last 48 hours, really, sort of on all the different talk shows, people discussing it. What's your response? How did you sort of interpret that Jenrick video and the debate that it's created?
Well, I think I kind of, as you would expect, lean very heavily towards the kind of leftist proposal that you laid out there. I do feel like the social contract is broken. We basically don't have a social contract. The kind of cultural neoliberalism, again, that we have imbibed as a culture, as a society since 1979 is one in which we don't have the assumption of a social contract. That's been the dominant economic narrative for the last 46 years, right? That hasn't changed, and it's only gotten worse since then, in a world where we're atomized, where we are seen to take every single action and transaction that we make within society as being done for self-interest and self-preservation rather than towards a societal project, right? That is Thatcherism, plain and simple. And this was a deliberate thing, right? It just, as a Marxist would say, that the base informs the superstructure, Margaret Thatcher would have said, well, the method is economics, but the goal is to change the soul. And at the point at which we don't have any kind of shared goal as a society, at the moment where we don't want to create a society or a community and we're only individual actors making individual economic transactions, well, yeah, of course, we're not going to think that it is worth paying into something if we believe that it's not being done for the good of us, especially not at a time in which it feels like the elites and the people in charge and the establishment all look like the rules don't apply to them as well. And again, that's always been the case for the last 46 years as well. We had 2008 where the banks were bailed out and no one else got anything close to that remuneration. We had to close libraries in Wolverhampton, as Alexei Sell famously pointed out, to solve the problem caused by the super rich and traders and people like that. And then austerity was pushed upon the population at large. And then during the pandemic, the rich got fabulously wealthy whilst our own elected politicians were breaking the laws that they set. I don't think anyone looks at our society, whether they're from the right or the left, and can see a functioning social contract. Which I think is important, though, is that the message that Robert Jenrick is putting out there, it's not for Londoners. I think people try and look at this as him denigrating London because he wants to try and win people over who are scared about London, who live there. No, this is for the curtain twitcher brigade outside of London. It's for people going, oh, look, you can't elect the left, the scary lefties like Sadiq Khan's, it ruins the scary London place. You'd never want to go to London, would you? It's all got the scary knife crime and barbershops and phone theft. And I'm like, well, that's, I think, overstated somewhat in the way that Hugo Rifkin would say, but I think these things are, once we look at the stats, we can have a little bit more of an actual appreciation of where the data lies on this one. But broadly, I think that the main issue that we have is inequality. When you have levels of petty theft, when you have rates of small, low-level crime, this is symptomatic of not just poverty specifically, but relative poverty. It is inequality that is the problem, right? You see plenty of countries, for example, in the global south, those kind of societies, where you do still see a social contract, you do still see far more community cohesion, even though they're in poverty, because the relative poverty isn't that bad. Yet what is unique, especially in the neoliberal West, outside of the more equal social democracies in Northern Europe, especially where they have a much greater social contract, a much greater buy-in from society, is you do see places like you'll see boroughs in London where you'll have one street on one end where you'll have people on breadlines in council housing, and on the very same street at the other end you'll have millionaire, multi-million pound penthouses, or even empty housing being owned by Russian, or I guess previously Russian, oligarchs to use as a cash cow and as an investment vehicle. I mean, you talked about Turkish barbershops about being potentially money laundering ventures, and there's some evidence of this in his video. And I'm like, well, the biggest money laundering operation in this country is the City of London, right? If we're looking towards Turkish barbershops as patient zero here, and not towards, Canary Wharf, for example, we're looking in the wrong places. But of course, it's the people who are doing the white-collar crime, I guess, who are related to the sector, I guess, which is more focused on white-collar crime, who donate to the Conservative Party. So Robert Jenrick's not going to criticise them, but he can very easily pander to the kind of curtain twitcher, as I said, conservative demographic by scaring them about what the inner cities look like. There's a big thing where people, especially anti-immigration people, fear their little rural town or community looking like the big cities, even though what's actually happening in the big cities probably wouldn't happen there at all.
Yeah, we'll go to the stats in one moment. I suppose I see the point behind all three of those positions. Now, I don't in any way empathise with Robert Jenrick because he's talking about a breakdown in law and order, and obviously his party caused it. I think defunding the police, that like the Tories did, was really stupid. Like there is sort of very clear data from the IFS that sort of showed where local police stations shut down, you did have a relative increase in crime. So I think that was stupid, and I don't think that the left should be scared to say, you should invest in the police because it's not good for society to see people sort of openly breaking rules all the time. I've obviously got loads of sympathy with the argument you've just made to say that one of the big reasons why there has been some degree of social decay is because of inequality, austerity, youth centres very clearly. I think it's so obvious to see the connection between shutting down youth centres and, as we're going to see, knife crime has gone in the wrong direction. I do also, though, have a fair amount of sympathy with the argument that Hugo Rifkind made, which is that we're massively overstating the problem here to some degree. Let's look at some statistics. So this is data from the England and Wales Crime Survey. And it shows you that the number of people telling the survey they've experienced a crime in the past year has fallen by more than 75% since the mid-90s. In 2024, it was up 15% on the previous year, but that's that sort of small little blue thing you can see there. Obviously, you didn't get data during COVID, so that's why you got that breakup. The higher lines there are if you include computer fraud. On the sort of less positive side, police recorded knife crime is significantly higher than it was in 2014. There were 50,000 offences involving a knife in 2024 compared to just 26,000 in 2010. Although knife crime was actually higher at points in the noughties, so it depends where you start your graph. In London, this is a graph which goes much further back, as you can see. The peak in homicides was in 2003, 2004, when 211 people were killed. In 2023, 2024, the number was half that at 108. Now, as far as I understand, that there are some crimes which have clearly gone up. Phone thefts and bike thefts in London do seem fairly endemic at the moment. I've seen, in the past 12 months, someone steal a bike off someone in a park and someone steal a phone out of someone's hand. So that is something which everyone is very much aware of. But that also happened in the past, and overall crime is massively down. And London, I totally agree with Hugo Rifkind, is a much safer place to walk around now than it was 20 years ago. So I live in Hackney at the moment. I was brought up in Leighton, which was just next door. And when I was a kid, if I found out someone lived in Hackney, I'd be like, oh, that's a bit of a scary place to go. And that was because crime was quite high in Hackney, and it's not anymore. This is largely, by the way, to do with sort of CCTV. It's harder to steal a car now than it ever was. And Helena, I suppose I have a theory here, which is that one of the big reasons for polarization, one of the big reasons why everyone is so negative about everything and potentially sees sort of, everyone thinks society is going in a terrible direction in every single aspect, is because of smartphones. Because it's not that crime has increased, it's that people see more criminal activities because people keep sharing them on their phones. So the reason people think London is out of control is because you see this video on your X feed, which is showing, a couple of kids waving a knife around. Obviously, kids waving knives around is terrible. It shouldn't happen. But that also happened 20 years ago, and people didn't think about it so much because you didn't get this one video that then goes viral, and then everyone thinks, "Oh my God, this is terrible." And then I think what you get is it increases polarization, because anyone who's sort of right leaning thinks, "Oh, I've seen this video of a kid holding a knife. This means crime's out of control. Law and order has broken down." And then on the other side, you have a video of like a police officer being horrible to someone, and then everyone thinks, "Oh, this is endemic. Police violence is getting worse. Crime is getting worse." Everyone thinks everything's getting worse because these videos are going viral, when on all accounts, the statistics shows that actually you're safer from everyone than you used to be. The AI sort of overlord might change all of this in the next 5 years. But as it stands, I do think that people have a more negative impression of life outside than they need to because of sort of the dynamics of social media. I don't know. What do you think about that?
And I think that you're absolutely right, for sure, at least to some extent, right? I'm not a criminologist. I couldn't tell you the relationships between people's perceptions of crime and the reality of crime in a kind of quantitative sense, But I think you've definitely onto something there. And on top of this, the social media algorithms are primed to create even more of this polarization. Of course, the access that social media gives you is much higher, but that access is predicated on the social media algorithms prioritizing engagement and prioritizing contention, because contentiousness is also a very engaging, right? Trying to get people into arguments, driving levels of antagonism on social media between especially different polarized groups of people is an excellent way to be able to target more adverts at people. And of course, there are plenty of ways in which that, as we have seen historically in the kind of Cambridge Analytica era that we're living in, is that for political purposes, people are able to try to pay money for adverts to try and foment these narratives further. Once they know that these things are popular and have engagement, they can ride that to be able to drive that polarization further for their own ends too. So it's kind of a very self-invigorating, or I'm forgetting the term that we used here, right? So it's self-reinforcing. It's a self-reinforcing mechanism, circular here, that allows this to go even further to drive this, which I think is a really interesting point. And that is the kind of demographic I think that Robert Jenrick is trying to appeal to with the video. As I called them, don't want to look like a boomerphobe, because I talk about it far too often, right? Don't want to drive into generational conflict here. But I do feel like there is a certain generation of people who never really grew up as digital natives in the social media era, who got onto social media during the pandemic because they were stuck at home with nothing else to do, and don't have a similar kind of filter system to digital natives to understand the framing of what they're being given through their social media algorithms, right? They don't understand how to properly filter out the level to which something is an immediate and or pressing concern, because it's again being framed for them by the kind of things that they're being given through these social media algorithms. It's when you know that some things are worth taking with a pinch of salt or not, because that's what you've grown up with, it's very easy to be able to at least somewhat distinguish between something that you should care about and something that you shouldn't. But if you're somebody who's only got into social media, or at least heavily into social media in the last 5 years or so, that filter system hasn't existed yet. And we've seen levels of zero-sum thinking. We've seen levels of the level to which people feel distrustful, much increasing in that specific demographic of people as well. The interesting data from More in Common about levels of zero-sum thinking, the ways in which people feel unsure about their future, in which generations and which cohorts that's increasing. Well worth looking into that data. I mean, again, I don't have all the answers here, but I think you've got a really interesting proposal there.
Artificial intelligence is set to decimate white-collar jobs. That's the message from Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, in a new interview with Axios. The article is called Behind the Curtain, a white-collar bloodbath. And in it, Amodei warns that AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. Now, Anthropic is one of the biggest AI companies, so I suppose along with Google DeepMind and OpenAI. Its CEO is one of the most active in speaking to the press, and we've covered his statements before on recent shows. He likes making very big claims. And this is what he said the exponential growth of AI models, or the power of AI models, could deliver in the very near future. So he says, cancer is cured, that's good. The economy grows at 10% a year, fine, fabulous. The budget is balanced, great. And 20% of people don't have jobs. So that's the downside. I mean, also, as we've talked about in previous shows, the other downside could be if this AI outsmarts us and then decides that it doesn't need humans around. But we'll park that to one side for this segment. Perhaps ironically, one of the first jobs to be destroyed by generative AI are some of the people who created it, coders. So the Axios article makes reference to the boss of another AI superpower, Mark Zuckerberg. So Meta, obviously, I'm also very heavily invested in AI. So Axios says Zuckerberg in January told Joe Rogan, probably in 2025, we at Meta, as well as the other companies that are basically working on this, are going to have an AI that can effectively be a sort of mid-level engineer that you have at your company that can write code. He said this will eventually reduce the need for humans to do this work. And then shortly after, Axios says Meta announced plans to shrink its workforce by 5%. Now, one consequence of this all, as well as an increase in unemployment generally, will be that it's harder for people to enter industry, so recent graduates, for example, because junior jobs are the ones that it's easiest to automate. So earlier this month, an executive at LinkedIn made precisely this point in the New York Times. So in the piece, the exec wrote this: in tech, advanced coding tools are creeping into the tasks of writing simple code and debugging, the ways junior developers gain experience. In law firms, junior paralegals and first-year associates who once cut their teeth on document reviews are handing weeks of work over to AI tools to complete in a matter of hours. And across retailers, AI chatbots and automated customer service tools are taking on duties once assigned to young associates. These changes coincide with a shift appearing in the latest employment numbers. The unemployment rate for college grads has risen 30% since September 2022, compared with about 18% for all workers. Obviously, this creates a lot of problems because obviously, at the moment, it's hard to automate those senior jobs, but it's quite easy. Well, it's getting easier to automate those sort of lower ranking jobs. Obviously, this is terrible for graduates because it's very difficult to get those lower ranking jobs, and you obviously can't get a higher ranking job without experience. Also, would be very problematic for the long term future of those industries, because the way you get good lawyers and good coders is you have people who've gone up the professional job ladder, and now the bottom rungs, I suppose, are being hacked off. The Axios article we showed you was by Jim van der Heij and another journalist. Jim van der Heij is also CEO of Axios, and he spoke to MSNBC about his interview with Amadei.
In his mind, I think it's sounding the alarm. It's like, listen, we got to have a national debate that this isn't 10 years from now. It could be 6 months from now. It could be 12 months from now. Then there has to be a debate about, okay, how do you make sure that workers are prepared to use artificial intelligence to augment their work, not displace their work? That's what we've been doing at Axios. We give everybody access to the technology. We have a deal with OpenAI. We make sure that every single unit, no matter what your job is already playing with this to figure out how are you going to augment your work so you don't get displaced by it. Hell, I told my own staff, you're committing career suicide if you're not spending 10% of your day experimenting with the technology. And I don't think most people are. I think people are like, whoa, this is too science fiction, or, it's a really neat search engine. They're not actually looking at the capabilities. They don't have the time. They have real lives. But I think Dario's point was they might not wake up until it's way too late. And if lawmakers are way too late to it, you could have real issues. You could have unemployment, as he said, 10 to 20%, if he's right, which would then lead to obvious political unrest. We have Steve Bannon on the record in there saying he thinks the exact same thing is going to play out. He said Trump's not talking about it, but he thinks this will be maybe the biggest topic of the 2028 presidential election.
So Amadei sort of says he's talking about this, Dario Amadei, the CEO of Anthropic, and because he wants sort of policymakers to get ahead of the issue. That said, Amadei is also very clear he doesn't really want his industry to be regulated anymore. And we showed you a clip earlier in the week of him saying you couldn't possibly regulate us because then China would get ahead. Somewhat self-serving argument to be making. They don't want to be regulated in their gung-ho drive for super intelligent machines. But he is suggesting something which he thinks could be, I suppose, a sop to the general public who might be worried about all losing their jobs. So this is from Axios again. So they say, a policy idea Amadei floated with us is a token tax. Every time someone uses a model and the AI company makes money, perhaps 3% of that revenue goes to the government and is redistributed in some way. Obviously, that's not in my economic interest, he added, but I think that would be a reasonable solution to the problem. And if AI's power races ahead the way he expects, that could raise trillions of dollars. The bottom line, you can't just step in front of the train and stop it, Amadei says. The only move that's going to work is steering the train, steer it 10 degrees in a different direction from where it was going. That can be done. That's possible, but we have to do it now. Helena, so Amadei puts this forward as sort of like, this isn't going to be in my interest, but I'm willing to do this, maybe to fund a UBI. A UBI, Universal Basic Income, is the kind of thing they do talk about in Silicon Valley. But he's saying it's very generous. He's saying this technology could create trillions of dollars. So 3% of trillions is still a lot, so that's going to be all right for you plebs out there. Well, 97% of trillions is much bigger. So Why is he only throwing us 3%? Right? If you've created this, I mean, he's suggesting it's going to be this sort of money printing machine. Essentially, this technology, once you make it super intelligent, can do absolutely anything, and we're supposed to be grateful for 3%. Seems like a lowball offer for me. I'm not accepting 3% yet, at least until, if the alternative is, that none of us get to exist anymore because the AI is sort of this autonomous swarm of drones, then maybe I would. But I'm not happy about this SOP. We're supposed to say thank you, Dario Amodei, for offering us 3% of your trillions of revenue.
What I find quite interesting, so what I compare this to is when Warren Buffett described taxation on the rich as guillotine insurance, right? I think this is essentially a similar kind of gambit where they say, no, it's fine. You can give us all the power, because a lot of these tech entrepreneurs, whilst they are definitely motivated by money, at least to some extent, a lot of them are motivated by power. And so they will almost certainly know that if the doomsaying about the future of their product becomes true, they're going to have a lot of angry plebs on their hands. And so they've got to be able to offer as little as they possibly can to get away with keeping control of the money printer itself, so that they can actually be in the ones who in control of where the rest of that money goes, right? Because you've got to expect, in a world where the AI tech entrepreneurs control huge amounts of the economy, they're also going to have a really big influence on how democracy functions as well. So any tax that any government does take off them in the first place, then redistribute to everybody, is almost certainly going to be democratically, at least somewhat, potentially to a very large extent, influenced by these tech companies as well. And of course, as has always been the case and with regards to social democracy, taxation and redistribution is a bandage solution on the pre-distribution that the structure of the economy takes under free market capitalism, right? In that we have a big level of inequality and the government goes, I'm taking from you and I'm giving to you, right? You own all of the things. You're the capitalist. You own all of the actual machines that do the AI that have gotten rid of all of those jobs. I have some skepticism as to whether jobs would just immediately go, whether they would be kind of broken over time. People like Schumpeter and said different things, and maybe we'd get rid of some bullshit jobs, as David Graeber would say, but it depends on where these jobs are, how quickly they come, and how quickly the economy adapts and takes that new productivity and relocates it elsewhere, right? But if those jobs do go, then the actual extra productivity gains from those machines that controls the AI, it's only having to be redistributed away from the rich because they own those machines, because they own the bank of service or whatever it is that is in control of the artificial intelligence. There is a very easy solution that solves all of these problems without having to do any of this, which is socialism. It is public ownership, collective ownership, rather than allowing individual tech entrepreneurs who believe they're greater than God having all of this power to then deign to shower what little extra they can give back to the serfs under their technological fiefdom. Why should we rely on this when we could own it ourselves, but make it become a public good, and then all of the increases in productivity gains, which is where wealth comes from, increases in total factor productivity, could automatically be pre-distributed collectively amongst the people of society. And then if those jobs go, it doesn't matter if your job gets taken, because we are going to be able to have things like universal basic income. That means it doesn't matter. And we can shorten the working week rather than having to continue to work very long hours for low pay whilst the capitalists who own the labor-saving devices take all of those additional productivity profits for themselves. We can spread that out amongst everybody and make a better, more automated luxury communist society for all of us. A girl can dream.
Metalhead 2550 has made a really good point in the comments that I missed, right? So the final statement I read from you from Dario Amodei was this. So he said, the bottom line, you can't just step in front of the train and stop it. The only move that's going to work is steering the train. Steer it 10 degrees in a different direction from where it was going. That can be done. That's possible, but we have to do it now. And Metalhead points out, that's not how trains work. You don't steer trains. So if there is a train coming towards you, you can't say, oh, can you go 10% to the right? Because it's a train track. The only way to not get run over by the train is to stop the goddamn thing. Yes, you can't stop if it's difficult to stop if you're outside the train. But if you're the driver of the train, and let's face it, Dario Amodei is one of the main drivers of the train, just pull the brakes, right? Just pull the brakes. If AI is going to do all of these brilliant things, let's wait a few years and work out how it's going to do it. Work out how we are going to sort of approach this as a society, work out whether it's going to kill us all. But at the moment, they're saying, we need to keep this train going super, super fast as it can possibly go. Might kill you all, might take all of your jobs, but we really have to get there in the next 6 to 18 months. How about we explore the technology and get there in 8 to 10 years, right? Or maybe we discover it's too dangerous that we don't want to do it at all and we just sort of shut it down. But the idea that you have all of these tech executives saying, this is really dangerous, might destroy all of your jobs, might cause some sort of social revolution because so many people are out of work, might in fact gain its own agency and decide that it doesn't want humans around, but we're going to still build it as fast as we possibly can. It doesn't make any sense. Pull the brakes, right? Don't you've got this guy sort of riding, we're all on the tracks. There's a train driver driving the train. He says, look, guys, no, I'm not going to hit the brakes. That would be silly. That would be sort of, you can't fight progress. But what I'm going to do is cross my fingers and hope that this train goes 10% to the left or right. That's impossible. The only thing you can do is pause until someone's worked out what the hell is going on. I'm going to be talking about this very soon. I've got a guest coming on from the Pause AI movement. So if you're watching this and you still think I'm completely off the wall on all of this, that might persuade you to some degree. Don't worry if it doesn't. It's also fine to disagree. Helena, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure having you on.
And the words of Vicky, the autonomous robot from iRobot, my logic is undeniable.
Very good. And we'd never automate you, Helena, just as I'm getting it written into my Novara Media contract that I'll never be automated either. I haven't done that really, although I should do. Should get around to that. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. Hopefully we'll still be here. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.